You know what? Do me a favor real quick. There's a coffee cart down on the second floor, right? Large black, 2 sugars. And if they've still got one of those almond croissants in the case, grab me one of those too. Thanks, hun. For a moment that lasted somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds, Dr. Amara simply stayed exactly where she was. Her weight settled evenly on both feet, her hands resting lightly on the back of the leather chair in front of her, her expression registering neither surprise nor offense nor any of the smaller, more involuntary reactions that a different woman in a different career might have allowed onto her face. She did not blink any faster than usual. She did not adjust her posture. She did not glance at the door, or at the clock on the far wall, or at any of the other people in the room who were going to spend the next 40 minutes of their lives wishing they had been somewhere else when this particular sentence was uttered. She was standing at the head of the surgical conference room on the 7th floor of Whitfield Memorial Hospital, the teaching hospital where she had served as chief of cardiothoracic surgery for the past 6 years. She was looking at the man who had just spoken to her with the particular stillness of a woman who had heard the same sentence, with minor variations, in roughly 47 different rooms across roughly 21 years of her professional life. The man was Gregory. He was 58 years old, the newly appointed regional director for the Beaumont Health Network, the corporate parent that had acquired Whitfield Memorial 9 weeks earlier. He had flown in from Dallas the night before for what had been described in the calendar invitation as a strategic alignment session between the new corporate leadership and the senior medical staff. The session was scheduled to begin in 14 minutes. He had arrived 25 minutes early, accompanied by 2 members of his corporate transition team, both of whom were currently setting up laptops at the long end of the polished walnut table. Dr. Amara had walked into the conference room 4 minutes earlier. She was wearing dark gray surgical scrubs underneath a knee-length white coat, her name embroidered in navy thread above the left chest pocket, the embroidery so small that a person who was not actually looking for it would have to lean in to read it. She had come directly from a 6-hour valve replacement that had ended at 5 minutes past noon, and she was carrying a tablet under her arm and a thin manila folder in her hand. She had set the tablet down on the credenza near the door and walked to the head of the table because the strategic alignment session was, in the assessment of the senior medical staff, who had been notified of its purpose 2 days earlier, the single most consequential meeting that would take place at Whitfield Memorial that entire fiscal quarter. Gregory had looked up when she walked in. He had not registered her. His eyes had moved over her the way the eyes of a certain kind of administrator move over a certain kind of clinical staff member. Briefly, automatically, with the unexamined categorization of a man who has decided in well under a second that the person in front of him is someone he does not need to introduce himself to. He had then asked her for the coffee. At the long end of the table, the hospital's chief of staff, a woman named Elena, who had worked alongside Dr. Amara for the past 9 years and who had served as her second chair on the executive committee for the past 4, had looked up from her own tablet with an expression that was rapidly traveling from confusion to a kind of horrified astonishment. Her mouth had opened. She had not yet decided what to say. She was performing in real time the calculation that any senior person performs when a more junior person, or in this case a person they wrongly perceive as more junior, has just walked into a much larger problem than they understand themselves to be in. The 2 members of Gregory's corporate transition team had not yet noticed. One of them was adjusting an HDMI cable. The other was sipping from a paper cup of coffee he had brought in with him from a chain shop 2 blocks away. Dr. Amara set the manila folder down on the table in front of her. She set it down slowly, deliberately, the way she set down everything when she was about to begin a conversation that she expected would have consequences. She did not respond to Gregory's request. She turned to Elena instead. "Elena, good to see you. How is your daughter doing? She started at Wesleyan last week, didn't she?" Elena's face did 3 things in rapid succession, and the third of those 3 things was the small, almost imperceptible adjustment of a woman who has just decided that she is not going to intervene in what is about to happen because the person at the head of the table does not require her intervention. "She did. She loves it, thank you for asking. How was the Hendricks case this morning?" "Long, clean margins, though. The valve seated well. I'll have the dictation done by 4. Gregory's face moved. It moved the way faces move when several pieces of information that should have been integrated 30 seconds earlier have arrived all at once, and the brain inside the face is performing an emergency reorganization of the entire room. The use of Dr. Amara's first name by the hospital's chief of staff. The reference to a 6-hour valve replacement performed that morning. the use of clinical language by the woman he had just asked to fetch him a croissant. The tone of voice Alina had used, which was the tone of voice that a senior administrator uses when addressing a person she considers a peer. All of it arrived in Gregory's brain at the same moment, and his face traveled through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 3 seconds. Confusion, the beginning of recognition, something that was not yet alarm but was unmistakably moving in that direction. And then, last of all, the small, sinking adjustment of a man who has begun to understand that he has made a mistake whose dimensions he does not yet fully know. Dr. Amara turned back to him. She looked at him for a long moment. She did not smile. She did not narrow her eyes. She did not perform any of the small facial gestures that a different woman might have performed in order to either soften the moment or sharpen it. She simply looked at him with the calm, measured attention of a surgeon evaluating a patient she was about to take into the operating theater. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Dr. Amara. I'm the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at this hospital. I'm also the senior clinical representative on the executive committee that was assembled to meet with you this afternoon. I'll be leading the medical staff's presentation in." She glanced at the clock on the wall, approximately 12 minutes. The silence that followed was not the silence of a single moment. It was the silence of a room in which one man's entire afternoon had just been disassembled in front of him and reassembled in a configuration he did not yet know how to inhabit. The 2 members of Gregory's transition team had finally registered that something had happened. The one who had been adjusting the HDMI cable was now standing very still, holding the cable in his hand, looking at his boss the way a person looks at someone who has just stepped on a part of the floor that turned out to be ice. The one who had been sipping from his paper cup of coffee had stopped sipping. He had not yet swallowed. Dr. Amara opened the manila folder. She did not look at Gregory. She was performing in this moment a small act of professional mercy that he was not yet equipped to recognize as mercy. She was giving him 30 seconds to begin assembling a response that he would not later wish he could revise. She was, in the language she sometimes used privately with the senior residents she had trained over the years, opening the chest before she made the first cut. What Gregory did not know, what he was about to learn over the course of the next 43 minutes in a manner that would end his oversight authority over Whitfield Memorial, and would 2 months later end his employment at the Beaumont Health Network in a quietly negotiated departure that the corporate press release would describe as a transition to pursue other opportunities, was that Dr. Amara had spent the previous 7 days reviewing, in fine detail, the operational consequences of the acquisition that had brought Gregory's transition team to the 7th floor of her hospital. She had also, in the 72 hours immediately preceding this meeting, finished drafting the medical staff's formal position statement on the proposed restructuring of 3 clinical departments, including her own. The position statement contained a series of findings that Dr. Amara was about to present to the room. The findings concerned a pattern of operational decisions made by Beaumont leadership in the 3 other regional acquisitions the network had completed in the previous 18 months, all of which had resulted in the demotion or quiet removal of senior women clinicians from positions of departmental authority. The pattern had been documented by a working group of physician executives across 4 states, several of whom had been in contact with Dr. Amara for the past 6 weeks. The documentation included, among other things, internal communications obtained through proper channels in which Beaumont's transition leadership had referred to senior female department chairs using language that, in any other industry, would have already cost several careers. The 4th incident in that pattern had just occurred in this conference room. Dr. Amara removed the position statement from the folder. She placed it face down on the table. The meeting was about to begin. To understand what was about to happen in that conference room, you need to understand who Dr. Amara actually was, because the assumption Gregory had made about her in less than a second was wrong in every single dimension, and the cost of that assumption was about to be calculated in front of him, line by line, with the same unhurried precision she brought to every other thing she did. Dr. Amara was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1977, the middle child in a family where her father had worked as a postal carrier for the United States Postal Service for 31 years on a single route that covered a neighborhood of 942 households, and her mother had worked as a labor and delivery nurse at the same county hospital for 26 years. They had bought a small brick house on the west side of the city in 1983. They had paid off the mortgage in the spring of 2009. On the afternoon they made the final payment, Her father had come home from his route at 12 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, sat down in the kitchen, taken off his shoes the way he always took off his shoes after a route, and quietly told her mother that there were now exactly 0 people in the world to whom they owed any money for the roof over their heads. Her mother had stopped what she was doing at the stove. She had walked over to the kitchen table, and she had sat down across from him, and she had put both of her hands flat on the wood. They had sat that way for a long time. Neither one of them had said anything. Dr. Amara, who had been 32 years old that spring and who had heard the story later that evening over the phone, had cried in the call room of the hospital where she was in her 4th year of cardiothoracic surgery fellowship. Her father had carried mail in the same neighborhood for so long that by the time he retired, he was attending the funerals of people who had been small children on his route when he had started it. He had known by name every dog on every block. He had known which households received Christmas cards from relatives in different states, and which households had stopped receiving them. And he had quietly factored this information into the small adjustments he made to the order in which he delivered the mail on the days when he suspected that a particular envelope might be the only piece of meaningful correspondence a particular elderly widow was going to receive that week. He had taught his 3 children that the world was made of small consistencies, and that the people who did the small consistencies well were the people who held the world together, regardless of whether the world noticed them doing it. There was a Saturday morning in the late spring of 1989 when Dr. Amara was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of grits and a glass of orange juice, when her mother had come home from a night shift at the labor and delivery ward with a small object wrapped in a paper towel. Her mother had not gone to bed. She had not changed out of her scrubs. She had sat down across from her daughter at the kitchen table, and she had unwrapped the paper towel, and she had set the object down between them. The object was a stethoscope. It was a standard-issue Littman cardiology III, navy blue tubing, the kind of stethoscope that nurses used, and that the residents and the attendings used, and that everybody on the labor and delivery ward used. And her mother had bought one and had wrapped it in a paper towel and had brought it home, and had set it on the kitchen table in front of her 12-year-old daughter on a Saturday morning before she had even taken off her shoes. "You said last week," her mother had told her, "that you wanted to be a doctor. I want you to know that I heard you. I want you to know that I have been thinking about it all week. I want you to know that I do not have any doubt that you can do it. This is so you can start practicing. You can listen to your sister's heartbeat. You can listen to your father's. You can listen to mine. You can learn to hear what is in there. Doctors are the people who learn to hear what is in there." Dr. Amara had been 12 years old. She had not actually believed until that morning that her mother had been listening. She had said it once briefly, after a school field trip to a science museum in which the docent had let her hold a plastic model of a human heart. She had not repeated it. Her mother had been on a double shift that week, and Dr. Amara had assumed, the way children assume, that the things she said in passing during her mother's exhausted weeks were not the things her mother held on to. Her mother had held on to it. Her mother had taken the second half of a 16-hour shift to drive to a medical supply store. The stethoscope had cost $96. Dr. Amara had owned exactly one item in her life of comparable value, a winter coat, and her mother had bought her a stethoscope. Dr. Amara had carried that stethoscope with her for the next 37 years. It was currently sitting in the second drawer of the desk in her office on the 6th floor of the building she now ran a department in, 2 floors below the conference room she was currently standing in. It was old now. The tubing had cracked in 2 places and had been repaired with medical tape that she had replaced 4 times over the years. The diaphragm was the original. She had not used it clinically since her 3rd year of residency, when she had been issued a newer one by the hospital. But she kept the old one in the drawer because there were days when the simple act of opening the drawer and looking at it was the thing that allowed her to close the drawer and go back to work. She had used it to listen to her sister's heartbeat on the afternoon her mother had given it to her. She had used it to listen to her father's heartbeat on the same day. She had used it on her mother that evening before her mother had finally gone to bed. She had used it on every member of her extended family at one point or another over the next 6 years. She had used it on the boy she had a crush on in 11th grade, briefly in the hallway between classes, as part of a joke that he had thought was flirtation, and that she had understood, even at 16, was actually reconnaissance. She had used it on a stray dog her family had taken in for 2 weeks before finding it a permanent home. She had used it on a newborn baby in the labor and delivery ward where her mother worked. On a night when her mother had brought her in to observe a delivery, on a doctor's quiet permission, the summer before she started college. She had heard in that small room on a hot July evening in 1995 the sound of a human heart that was less than 4 minutes old, and she had known in that moment, with the kind of certainty that does not require any further evidence, exactly what she was going to spend the rest of her life doing. She had graduated valedictorian of her high school. She had attended Spelman College on a full academic scholarship and had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in biology and a minor in mathematics. She had attended Johns Hopkins School of Medicine on a combination of need-based aid and a scholarship that had been established in the memory of a black woman cardiologist who had practiced in Baltimore in the 1960s. She had completed her general surgery residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she had been one of 2 black women in a program of 43 residents. She had then completed a cardiothoracic surgery fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic, where she had been the only black woman in the program in any of the 3 years she was there. She had been recruited to Whitfield Memorial Hospital in 2011 as an attending surgeon, had been promoted to associate chief of the department in 2016, and had been named chief of cardiothoracic surgery in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, after the previous chief had resigned for reasons that the hospital had never made public, and that Dr. Amara had never once discussed with anyone outside of her closest 2 colleagues. She had been the chief of the department for 6 years. In that time, the cardiothoracic surgery program at Whitfield Memorial had moved from a regional ranking of 47th in the country to a regional ranking of 19th. The program's 30-day mortality rate for high-risk valve replacements had dropped by 41%. The program had launched a transplantation service that had performed its 40th successful heart transplant the previous month. The program had also, under Dr. Amara's specific direction, established a fellowship slot reserved for surgeons from historically underrepresented backgrounds, a slot that had been filled in each of the past 5 years by a different woman of color, 4 of whom were now practicing attending surgeons at academic medical centers in 5 different states. Dr. Amara had been a guest of the White House twice. She had testified before a congressional subcommittee on hospital consolidation in rural communities. She had published 37 peer-reviewed papers. She had given a TED Talk that had been viewed 2 million times. She had been profiled in the New England Journal of Medicine in a piece that had appeared 18 months earlier, a piece that the corporate transition team at Beaumont Health Network had apparently not bothered to read before flying to her hospital to fundamentally restructure her department. She had a particular reputation among the surgeons and the residents who worked alongside her. They called her, privately and with a great deal of respect, the metronome. They called her that not because she was cold, although she could be cold when the situation required it, but because she was steady. In the operating room, in the conference room, in the family conference room where she had to tell a husband or a wife that the operation had not gone the way they had all hoped it would go, she was steady. Her voice did not rise. Her hands did not shake. Her pace did not change. She had learned over many years that a black woman who allowed her voice to rise in a professional environment was almost always heard as angry, regardless of the actual content of what she was saying. So she had stopped allowing her voice to rise. She had built an entire career on the principle that the most powerful sentence in any room is a true sentence delivered at the same pace as every other sentence she had delivered that day. She was about to deliver several true sentences in the next 40 minutes. Gregory was about to hear them. He was not going to enjoy the experience. Now you need to understand Gregory, because what was about to happen in that conference room was not random. It was the predictable, almost mechanical result of a man who had spent 34 years building a career inside a system that had taught him, year by year and title by title, that the people who held the clinical knowledge and the people who held the institutional power were 2 separate populations, and that the second population was the one that mattered, and that the second population looked, almost without exception, like him. Gregory was 58 years old. He had been the regional director for the Beaumont Health Network for 2 years. Before that, he had been the vice president of operations for a hospital management company in Phoenix for 7 years. Before that, he had been the chief operating officer of a 200-bed community hospital in suburban Ohio for 9 years. Before that, he had held a series of progressively more senior administrative positions at a regional health system in the upper Midwest. He had never, in his entire career, worked in a clinical capacity. He had never drawn blood, never started an IV, never set a bone, never delivered a baby, never told a family that the procedure had not gone the way everyone had hoped. He held a bachelor's degree in business administration from a state university in Indiana and a master's degree in health administration from a program he had completed at night over 4 years while working full-time. He was, in the language he used about himself in the interviews he gave to trade publications, an operator. He believed that hospitals were, at their core, complex businesses that happened to involve medicine, and that the job of a person like him was to bring discipline to the business so that the medicine could happen efficiently. He was, by his own frequent assessment, a turnaround guy. He used this phrase about himself at least twice a week. He had used it in his most recent interview with a healthcare industry publication, in which he had attributed his success to a willingness to make hard decisions, an eye for inefficiency, and a refusal to be intimidated by the cultural resistance that he said was endemic to legacy medical institutions. He had not mentioned in that interview that 2 of the 3 previous turnarounds he took credit for had resulted in patient safety scores that declined in the 2 years following his departure. He had not mentioned that the staffing reductions he had implemented at the hospital in suburban Ohio had been the subject of a state nursing board inquiry that had ultimately faulted the administration. These details had not seemed relevant to him. They had not been part of the story he told about himself. He had genuinely stopped thinking about them. Gregory was not, in his own conscious estimation of himself, a sexist or a racist. He would have been deeply, sincerely wounded by either accusation. He had a daughter he loved very much. He had hired women throughout his career. He had, at the hospital in Phoenix, personally championed the promotion of a Latina nurse manager to a director-level position, a fact he mentioned in roughly 1 out of every 3 speeches he gave at industry conferences. He genuinely believed that he evaluated people on their merits, and that the merits were all that mattered to him. What Gregory had, instead of conscious prejudice, was something more deeply embedded and considerably harder to correct. He had spent 34 years in administrative environments in which the people in the executive suite had been, with very few exceptions, white men, and in which the people in the scrubs and the white coats below the level of department chair had been an increasingly diverse population that his brain had filed over 3 decades into the category of staff. His brain had absorbed the pattern had hardened into a template, the template had become an automatic default. By the time he was 58 years old, when he walked into a clinical environment and saw a black woman in scrubs, his brain ran a calculation he was entirely unaware of running, and the calculation returned an answer, and the answer was nurse or technician or support staff, and the answer was never chief of cardiothoracic surgery, because in 34 years of his particular experience, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery had never once looked like the woman standing at the head of the conference table. He had asked Dr. Amara for coffee in exactly the same tone of voice he had used 40 minutes earlier with the actual administrative coordinator who had badged him through the security doors on the ground floor and walked him to the elevator. He had not registered any difference between the 2 interactions, because in the architecture of his unexamined defaults, there was no difference between them. The default was the default both times. What Gregory did not know, what he was about to learn, was that the physician working group that had been documenting Beaumont Health Network's pattern of conduct across its previous acquisitions had been coordinated, for the past 6 weeks, by the woman he had just asked to bring him an almond croissant. The position statement on the table contained the working group's findings. And the working group had been waiting, with the patient discipline of people who understood that timing was the entire difference between an intervention that changed an institution and an intervention that changed nothing at all, for exactly the right moment to present those findings to Beaumont's regional leadership. The right moment had just walked in the door. It had walked in, sat down at the head of the table, and asked Dr. Amara to bring it coffee. The conference room door opened. 3 more people walked in. The first was a man named David, one of the hospital's 2 deputy chiefs of staff, a 55-year-old white physician who had practiced internal medicine at Whitfield Memorial for 22 years, and who had walked into the room with the slightly distracted expression of a man who was running 90 seconds behind and had not yet registered the temperature of the air he had just entered. The second was a woman named Priya, a cardiac anesthesiologist who served as the secretary of the hospital's medical executive committee, and who had been, 18 months earlier, the first physician at Whitfield Memorial to formally document an incident involving a member of Beaumont's transition team. The third was a clinical operations analyst named Marcus. a quiet young man in a gray sweater who was carrying a stack of bound presentation folders, one for each seat at the table. David saw Dr. Amara at the head of the table and smiled the easy smile of a colleague. "Amara, there you are. I heard the Hendrix valve went long. You doing all right? Did you eat?" "I'm fine, David. Sit down. We're about to start." Something in the flatness of her tone made David look at her a second time more carefully. He had worked alongside her for 15 years. He had learned to read the small variations in her register the way a musician learns to read the small variations in a familiar piece. He registered in the space of about a second that something had already happened in this room before he had walked into it. He looked at Alina. Alina's face confirmed it. He looked at Gregory. Gregory's face confirmed it with considerably more specificity. David sat down. He did not ask another question. He had spent enough years in enough rooms to know precisely when to stop talking and let the person running the meeting run the meeting. Priya took her seat across from David. She set a slim folder on the table in front of her and squared its edges with both hands. She did not look at Gregory. She had been told that morning, in a brief conversation in Dr. Amara's office, exactly what was going to happen in this room, and she had been asked whether she was comfortable being present for it, and she had said yes. And she had then spent the 3 hours since that conversation preparing herself for the particular experience of sitting in the same room as a representative of the organization whose transition team had 18 months earlier. In a meeting in a different hospital in a different city, asked her to take notes for the men while the men talked. She had documented that request the same evening. She had filed it. She had assumed, the way most people who file such documentation assume, that it would sit somewhere and accumulate dust. Marcus moved around the table, setting a bound folder in front of each person, working from the far end toward the head. He set the last folder down in front of Dr. Amara, gave her a small nod that no one else in the room would have noticed, and left the room, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click that, in the silence of the room, sounded considerably louder than it actually was. Dr. Amara did not open her folder yet. She let the room settle. She let Gregory's 2 transition team members finish taking their seats. She let the silence do the thing that silence does in a room where everyone already knows that something is coming and no one yet knows its exact shape. Then she turned the position statement face up, and she folded her hands on top of it, and she looked down the length of the table at the man who had flown in from Dallas the night before. "Good afternoon," she said. "Thank you all for being here. Before we begin the substantive portion of today's session, I want to address something that occurred in this room approximately 9 minutes ago. I'm going to do this briefly, professionally, and on the record, because what I'm about to discuss is directly and materially relevant to the position the medical staff is going to present in the materials in front of you." Gregory's face had gone through another series of revisions in the preceding minutes. The pallor that had set in when Alina used Dr. Amara's first name had been overtaken by a flush that was climbing steadily from his collar toward his jaw. His hands were folded on the table in front of him in a posture that he was visibly working to keep still. He opened his mouth. Dr. Amara raised one hand. She did not raise it sharply. She raised it perhaps 4 inches off the table, palms slightly turned, in a gesture that communicated without any force whatsoever that the floor was hers and that she was not yet finished with it. "When I walked into this room 12 minutes ago," she said, "you asked me to go down to the 2nd floor and bring you a coffee and a croissant. You did this without asking my name, without asking my role at this hospital, and without opening the meeting materials in front of you, which list me, on the 2nd page, as the chief of cardiothoracic surgery and the lead presenter for this afternoon's session. I want to be clear that I'm not raising this because I'm personally wounded by it. I've been a physician for 21 years. I've heard that request, in one form or another, more times than I can count. I'm raising it because it is the 4th documented incident of its kind involving members of your organization and members of this medical staff, and the first 3 are described in detail on the page you're about to turn to." She turned to the 2nd page of the bound materials. So did everyone else at the table. The page was titled, in plain black text across the top, "Pattern of Conduct. Documented Incidents, Beaumont Health Network Transition Operations." There were 3 entries on the page. Each entry contained a date, a location, the name and title of the affected clinician, a brief factual description of what had occurred, and a reference to the page in the supporting appendix where the full contemporaneous documentation could be found. Alina had already begun reading the page. Her expression had become very carefully neutral, the neutrality of a person who is exercising deliberate control over her face. David had begun reading the page as well, and his easy smile from a few minutes earlier was entirely gone now, replaced by the particular focus of a man who has just realized that the meeting he wandered into 90 seconds late is a meeting that people are going to be talking about for years. One of Gregory's transition team members had begun reading the page and had stopped breathing. The other was looking at Gregory and very deliberately not looking at the page, as though the page were a thing he could decline to be associated with by refusing to acknowledge its existence. Gregory had not picked up his copy. He was looking at Dr. Amara. "I want to be precise about what is in this document," she said. "These are not allegations. These are not accusations. These are documented observations, recorded contemporaneously by the affected clinicians on the day each incident occurred, and reviewed by me in my capacity as the coordinator of a multi-state physician working group that has been studying the operational conduct of your organization across its recent acquisitions. The first entry concerns a cardiac anesthesiologist who, during a transition planning meeting 18 months ago, was asked by a member of your team to take notes for the room. She was the only woman at the table and the only person of color at the table, and she was, at the time, the secretary of her hospital's medical executive committee. The second entry concerns a chief of obstetrics at a Beaumont facility in another state who was, during a budget review, repeatedly addressed by a Beaumont vice president as the charge nurse, and who was corrected by name and title 4 separate times in the same meeting by her own colleagues before the vice president stopped doing it. The third entry concerns a department chair in nephrology who, in a written communication that I have a copy of, was described by a member of your transition leadership as, and I'm quoting the document directly, a diversity hire we inherited. The room was completely silent. The flush had drained out of Gregory's face and the pallor had returned, and now the pallor had a quality to it that a leaner, watching from the long end of the table, recognized from the operating theater, the specific gray of a person whose blood pressure has begun to do something his body has not yet caught up to. "I have not made any of this public," Dr. Amara said. "I have not sent it to your board. I have not filed a complaint with any state regulatory body or any federal agency. I have not contacted any journalist, although I will tell you honestly that I have been contacted by 2 of them and have declined both. Until this afternoon, the working group's position had been that the appropriate venue for this conversation was a direct conversation, in a room like this one, with the leadership responsible for the conduct. That position has not changed. What changed approximately 9 minutes ago was that you provided a 4th data point, and the 4th data point was not directed at a junior clinician or a member of the support staff. The 4th data point was directed at the chief of cardiothoracic surgery in her own hospital, in the room where she was scheduled to present to you, with her name printed on the 2nd page of the agenda in front of you. She turned to the 3rd page. "I want to explain why that matters," she said, "because I think it would be easy to dismiss what happened this afternoon as an isolated mistake by a person who was tired or distracted or unfamiliar with our staff. And if it were the first incident, I would be inclined to extend exactly that grace. But it is the 4th. And the 4th incident tells me something the first 3 could not tell me on their own. Each of the first 3 involved a clinician who was, in the corporate structure, more vulnerable than I am. An anesthesiologist, a department chair at a facility your organization controls, a nephrologist whose contract your organization holds. Each of them chose to document rather than confront, because the cost of confrontation for a clinician whose institution has just been acquired is significant and real. Today, you said essentially the same thing to a surgeon whose name is on a TED Talk that 2 million people have watched, who testified before Congress 18 months ago, and who runs the 19th-ranked cardiothoracic program in the country. You said it with exactly the same casualness you would have used with anyone else, which tells me with a high degree of clinical confidence that the casualness is not situational. It is structural. It is not about who you thought I was. It is about how your organization sees a certain kind of person, regardless of what that person has actually accomplished." She turned to the 4th page. So did everyone else at the table. The 4th page of the bound materials was titled, in the same plain black text, Medical Staff Position and Required Conditions. There were 3 paragraphs on the page. Dr. Amara did not read them aloud, because everyone in the room was capable of reading them silently, and because she had learned a long time ago that there are moments when the most powerful thing a person at the head of a table can do is stop talking and let the room read. She gave them 40 seconds. Alina read it, and her hand came up and pressed flat against her own sternum, an involuntary gesture, the gesture of a person bracing against something. David read it, and he set his copy down very slowly and looked across the table at Dr. Amara with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and something that was very close to pride. The transition team member who had stopped breathing read it and closed his eyes. Gregory read it. His face, which had traveled through a long sequence of expressions over the preceding 15 minutes, finally settled on one, and the expression it settled on was not anger and was not embarrassment. It was the flat, hollow, distant expression of a man who has understood, with complete and final clarity, that the situation he is sitting in is no longer one he can negotiate his way out of, and that he is going to spend the remainder of this afternoon and a considerable portion of the months that follow it dealing with the consequences of a sentence he had spoken without thinking about it for a single second. The first paragraph read as follows. Effective immediately, the medical staff of Whitfield Memorial Hospital, acting through its Medical Executive Committee, formally opposes the proposed restructuring of the departments of cardiothoracic surgery, obstetrics, and nephrology, as outlined in the Beaumont Health Network Integration Plan dated the previous month. The medical staff's opposition is based on a documented determination that the restructuring would remove or diminish the authority of 3 department chairs, all 3 of whom are women, 2 of whom are women of color, in a manner consistent with a pattern of conduct observed across the network's 3 prior regional acquisitions, and that this restructuring is not supported by any clinical or operational rationale that withstands review. The second paragraph read as follows. As a condition of the medical staff's continued cooperation with the integration process, the medical staff requires that Beaumont Health Network engage a credentialed, independent third party to conduct a full review of the conduct documented in the attached appendix, and that the regional director responsible for the integration of Whitfield Memorial complete a documented executive accountability engagement with a qualified provider, focused on conduct in clinical environments and on the structural assumptions that produce the pattern described in this statement. This engagement will be conducted at the network's expense. The review and the engagement are not negotiable. The medical staff will not proceed under leadership that declines them. The third paragraph read as follows. Should Beaumont Health Network decline these conditions, the Medical Executive Committee is prepared to refer the documented record to the State Department of Health, to the relevant accreditation bodies, and in the event that no good faith response is received within 90 days, to make the record available to the physician working group's counterparts in the 4 other states in which the network operates. The medical staff would strongly prefer not to take any of these steps. The medical staff is prepared to take all of them. Dr. Amara let the room finish. Then she folded her hands again on top of the page. I want to address 2 things before we discuss this, she said. The first is procedural. The members of the Medical Executive Committee who are in this room were each shown this position statement before this meeting. They each approved it. The Chief of Staff approved it. The 2 Deputy Chiefs of Staff approved it. This is not my personal position. It is the formal position of the medical staff of this hospital, arrived at through the proper governance process, and I am presenting it in my capacity as the lead author and the working group coordinator, but the authority behind it is institutional, not personal. I want that to be unambiguous, so that no one in this room is under the impression that this is one surgeon settling a personal score. She paused. The second thing I want to address is the accountability engagement, because I'm aware that it is unusual. Most medical staffs, faced with an acquisition they object to, would either resist quietly through the slow machinery of committee and delay, or they would comply and absorb the damage. We have chosen a third option. We have chosen to be direct about the problem and to offer a path that addresses it rather than simply punishing it. We are doing this because, contrary to what you may assume given the contents of this document, we are not your adversaries. The clinicians in this building want this integration to succeed. They want the resources your network can provide. They want the capital improvements and the expanded research budget and the regional referral network. What they are not willing to do is purchase those things with the careers of 3 women who built the departments you flew here to dismantle. Those 2 things have to be balanced. The statement in front of you is our best attempt at the balance. She turned the page back over and rested her hands on it. Mr. Gregory, I'm going to give you the floor now. I'd ask before you respond that you take a moment. I've sat where you're sitting. I've received difficult professional feedback in front of people whose respect I cared about, and I've learned that the response I gave in the first 60 seconds was almost always a response I later wished I could take back. So I'm offering you that minute. I'd encourage you to use it." She sat down in the chair at the head of the table, unhurried, and she folded her hands in her lap and she waited. A full minute passed. Dr. Amara did not look at the clock. She did not look at Gregory. She had said what she had come to say, and she was prepared to wait as long as the room required. When Gregory finally spoke, his voice was not the voice he had used when he asked for the coffee. It was lower and rougher, and it had aged somehow in the last 20 minutes. "Dr. Amara, I want to ask you a question, and I want to be clear that I'm not asking it to defend myself. I'm asking it because I genuinely want to understand. When I said what I said to you, when I asked you for the coffee, did you already know in that moment that this was coming? The position statement, the conditions, was this set up?" Dr. Amara looked at him. "No, there was no setup. This position statement was finalized at 6 o'clock this morning before I went into the operating room. It is based on the integration plan your team distributed last month and on the 3 documented incidents that predate today. The Medical Executive Committee approved it yesterday afternoon. What you did in this room 12 minutes ago was not planned by anyone, and it was certainly not planned by me. It was the 4th incident. It did not change one word of the statement. It confirmed every word of it." Gregory nodded slowly. He looked down at the page in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked back up, and this time he looked past Dr. Amara down the length of the table to where Priya was sitting with her folder squared in front of her. He had not until this moment registered her presence in the room. He registered it now. "You're the anesthesiologist," he said. "The first incident, the notes." Priya did not answer immediately. She looked at him with an expression that was perfectly composed. "Yes," she said. "I don't remember it," Gregory said. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending that I do. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen either, because I just gave a fresh example of exactly the same thing to your chief of surgery in front of all of you 20 minutes ago. So I believe it happened. I want to apologize to you. I don't expect the apology to mean very much, and I'm not offering it so that I can feel better about myself. I'm offering it because you're sitting at this table and you've earned the right to hear it said out loud." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice that was clear and steady and entirely her own, "Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. I'm going to need some time before I know what to do with it." "That's fair," Gregory said. He turned back to Dr. Amara. He took a long breath and let it out slowly. "I'm not going to respond to the position statement in this meeting," he said. "I want to take it back. I want to read the appendix. I want to read the documentation in full, including the email about the nephrologist. I want to think about it carefully, and I want to consult with people whose judgment I trust more than I currently trust my own. I'd like to schedule a follow-up within 72 hours, at which point I'll give you a formal response." "That's acceptable," Dr. Amara said. "I want to say one more thing," Gregory said, "and I want you to understand that I'm not saying it because I think it will change anything in that document. I'm saying it because I think it needs to be said in this room in front of these people on the record." He paused. He looked around the table slowly and then back to Dr. Amara. "I have spent my entire career telling myself that I see people for what they can do. I've said it in interviews. I've said it on conference stages. I championed a nurse manager in Phoenix, and I have told that story so many times that I think I started using it as proof that the rest of me didn't need examining. And then I walked into the best cardiothoracic program in this region, and I looked at the woman who built it, and I asked her to bring me a croissant. I don't think there's a version of that I can explain away. I think I just have to sit with what it means." He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He gathered the bound folder under his arm carefully, as though it were something that might break. He walked to the door. At the door he stopped and he turned back. "Dr. Amara, yes, thank you for doing this in a room instead of in a headline. I'm not sure I would have deserved it." "I know, Mr. Gregory." He left. The door closed softly behind him. Gregory's response came in 58 hours, not 72. He called Dr. Amara himself on a Thursday morning from his own cell phone, with no general counsel on the line and no transition team listening in. The call lasted 51 minutes. He accepted the position statement in full. He accepted the independent review. He accepted the restructuring of cardiothoracic surgery, obstetrics, and nephrology would be withdrawn entirely and rebuilt with the 3 department chairs at the table from the beginning. He had already, he told her, contacted 2 accountability providers from the list the committee had supplied, and had scheduled introductory conversations with both. He had also drafted apology letters to Priya, to the chief of obstetrics in the other state, and to the nephrologist who had been described in writing as a diversity hire we inherited, and he wanted to know whether sending them would create additional discomfort for the women involved, because he was not willing to send them if it would. Dr. Amara listened to all of it without interrupting. She did not tell him she was proud of him. He was not her resident and he was not her child. He was a 58-year-old executive who had finally, after 34 years of running on a default that had been invisible to him, looked at the default and decided to do something about it, and the decision was his to make, and it was not hers to celebrate. What she told him at the end of the call surprised him. "Mr. Gregory, I want to tell you something. In 21 years, I have been mistaken for a nurse more times than I can count, for a transport aide, for a translator, for the cleaning staff twice, while I was wearing my white coat with my name on it. On one occasion, a patient's family member handed me their lunch tray to take away while I was reviewing his post-operative imaging. I have stopped counting. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse. I'm telling you so that you understand that what you did in that room was not unusual. It was ordinary. The unusual part was that you happened to do it to the one person in the building with the institutional power to make it cost you something. Almost every woman this has ever happened to was not in that position. They are still out there. They are still working. They remember. And the way your network treats them from here is what will tell us whether anything actually changed, or whether you just learned to be careful around the women who can end your career." Gregory was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to deserve that distinction." "I hope so," she said. "I genuinely do." She ended the call. She sat at her desk and looked at the phone for a moment. Then she picked it up and called her mother in Birmingham. Her mother answered on the second ring. Dr. Amara told her the broad shape of it, the conference room, the coffee, the statement, the call. Her mother listened the way she had always listened, without interruption, until her daughter was finished. Then she said, "Baby, you remember that stethoscope I gave you?" "Of course I do. I bought it because I wanted you to learn to hear what was inside people. I used to worry I'd taught you to hear it too well, that you'd spend your whole life listening to everybody and nobody would ever listen back." She paused. "Sounds like that whole room listened to you on Monday." Dr. Amara closed her eyes and pressed her hand against her forehead and did not let her mother hear that she was crying, because she had been trained out of letting people hear that a very long time ago. The story did not leave the room. It was not leaked, not posted, not handed to a reporter. 6 people knew its full shape, and all 6 had reason to keep it. But the building changed in ways anyone paying attention could see. The 3 departments were rebuilt with their chairs intact. Priya accepted Gregory's letter and answered it in 4 sentences. The integration went forward, and the research budget arrived, and the referral network expanded, and the women who built the departments were still running them when it did. A year later, Dr. Amara established, through the Hospital Foundation, a surgical fellowship for first-generation women of color, 10 residents a year across 5 programs, each one paired with a senior mentor. She interviewed every candidate herself. She cried after several of the interviews and told no one. 18 months after the conference room, she stood at a podium in a ballroom in Atlanta, accepting an award she had tried to decline in front of 400 women, and she told them about a stethoscope her mother had bought with the second half of a 16-hour shift. "The room will be wrong about you," she told them. "Not you, the room. Your job is to keep standing exactly where you are, doing the work even when no one is watching, because that work is what changes the architecture of the buildings for the women who come after you. They may never know your name. They will walk through doors you held open. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing." Her mother was at table 4. She was 80 years old and she was crying, and the room rose to its feet, and Dr. Amara stepped down and walked to table 4 and took her mother's hand and held it while the applause went on. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. We tell the stories of the women the world tries to look past. The surgeons, the lawyers, the founders, the daughters of postal carriers and labor and delivery nurses who walked into rooms where they were not expected and refused to leave. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, that the room is wrong, not you, and that the work you do in the quiet when no one is watching is the work that changes everything. See you in the next video.